So let's talk about power hammer dies for a second. A common question that I see quite often is what kind of dies should I get with X power hammer, whether it be a tire hammer, self-contained air hammer, a little giant power hammer, whatever. You know, the question a lot of times when people are going to shop for those hammers or they're shopping around and that particular hammer they're looking at comes with one set of dies, they ask, is that the right kind of dies for whatever purpose? And so I wanted to make this video to talk about the kind of dies that I use the most often and why I think they're the best kind of dies to get for a power hammer. Okay, so these are dies for two different kinds of power hammers. All right, this one is kind of a slightly rounded die. You can see it's kind of domed a little bit. This one is a what's commonly known as a combination die or a combo die. It has a flat on one side and rounded on the other to allow you to draw material out rather aggressively on the rounded side and then clean it up or flatten it on the flats. And so these are two different types of dies. They both have different kinds of attachment methods to the bottom of the hammer. This one uses a dovetail slot with a key that goes in to hold the die in place. I'll show that in a second. And then this one simply screws down to the anvil on the tire hammer. This is a tire hammer die. You can get as many die shapes as you can think of. There's just, if you can think of a shape, you can turn it into a die and put it on a power hammer. However, for most power hammers, they're going to come with one, maybe two sets of dies unless you spend extra money and buy extra dies when you get them, but most power hammers come with a set of flat dies. So I want to talk about flat dies for a second and why I think and why many people think they are the best set of dies to get on a power hammer. So let's look at flat dies for a second. Okay, so on this hammer you can definitely see that this die is flat. It's held in place with a key and a dovetail system. So if I knock this key out, the die can just lift straight out. You'll notice this die has holes that you can pass bolts through, and this is to allow a die saddle system to go onto this particular style of die. So something like this. If I remove these bolts, I can put that on this flat die and have like an aggressive drawing die. These are flat dies on the tire hammer. Very similar to the other hammer, except these are bolted down. They're bolted down to the anvil and they're bolted to the ram on the top. The great thing about flat dies is that you can very quickly use tooling on the flat dies to shape metal however you want. Okay, so for a quick example of tooling, this is a power hammer flatter. And this would be laid on top of the material, on top of the flat die, to go across the material as you forge it in order to flatten out rough forging marks. That's just one example. All right, this is another example of tooling that can be used. This is a round ball swage. It's a closed die that you can place material in and then use the hammer to smash this spring swage die closed as the tire hammer hits it. So with a die like this, you can very quickly keep the flat dies in your hammer and use this specific tooling to do what you need to do rather than having to make a set of dedicated dies with this ball swage that you would then have to attach and unattach from the hammer as you use them. You just make tooling to go between flat dies. So this is, again, just one simple and quick example of why flat dies are great and how you would use tooling between them. Okay, here's another example of how to use flat dies with other tooling to maximize your efficiency. If you're having to constantly put specialized dies in place every time you want to do a specific task while forging, that can take a lot of time. So one thing that you can make is something called a die saddle. Now this is a device that I made in the Power Hammer Tools class that I took with Clay Spencer. It's an excellent class. If you get a chance to take that, I highly recommend it. So what this does is you make this to fit your dies and you leave a little extra room on the side so you can lay the die saddle over the flat and then you can make whatever shape you want. So this is called an aggressive drawing die. It's just on a piece of like angle iron basically with a die shape welded to the top. So this fits down on top of my flat die and is wedged in place with this die saddle. There's just a hole drilled in the side of here, and it's tapped, and there's a bolt that's been welded to this collar, and then this allows me to cinch that down really tight. And I have another one that goes on the top die. It just doesn't have the long lever because the top die is going to be moving up and down. So for the top die, I have the same mechanism, a top die saddle. This wraps around the top die. I can put another aggressive drawing die, just like this. And then my die saddle captures that in place, just like that. And then I can go to forging with these radical drawing dies in place, do whatever I need to do, and then very quickly take these out, and now I'm back to my flat dies. So here's one more example of a way to use tooling with flat dies. Again, I've got my die saddle here. I'll put this in place. This little piece gets captured on the side. Now I have a small combination die. This is a small flat and a ramp on this side, and this allows me to draw out tapers on the end of bars really, really quickly. Again, this is another tool that we made in the Power Hammer Tools class. It's basically a block of tool steel that's been forged down into a small combination die with a small piece of steel welded on the side so that the die saddle can capture it. Just that simple. Now, I do a lot of texturing with this hammer, and so I have come up with some small ball bearing dies that I use on the top. Again, small pieces of angle iron with a ball welded to it. I use my top die saddle around the top die, just like this. And boom, see, that ball is captured. Now I have an instant texturing die that I can use on the top. One thing I've found that you have to be careful with using ball bearing for dies, if you let those hit your flat dies, you'll ding your flat dies. So I use a little die protector on my lower die. I capture this in place with my lower die saddle, and that just protects my bottom die while I'm doing all the texturing. So all kinds of ideas. There's a larger ball bearing die that I use. There it is. That's one reason why I really like flat dies on power hammers. They're just so versatile. You can take the die saddles off and on really, really quickly and get back to your flats for cleaning things up. And in the long run, it's a lot cheaper to get one set of flat dies and then work out whatever tooling you need down the road, rather than buying a bunch of dedicated die sets, because these die sets are rather expensive. So I hope this video was helpful to those of you that might be contemplating the purchase of a tire hammer, or the build of a tire hammer, or an air hammer, or any other kind of power hammer, and whether or not you need specialty dies. They do have their purpose. They are nice to have. Multiple sets of dies are really nice to have for a power hammer, but if you only have one set, if you can only pick one set of dies when you're getting a power hammer, pick a flat die set, because there's just so much you can do when you make a die saddle for it. You can just very quickly, if you have access to a welder, you can very quickly weld up little die shapes to throw on your saddles for whatever task you have at hand. And so that's kind of the way I approach it now. I don't spend a whole lot of time trying to gather dies or make tooling. If a job comes up and I don't already have a die set that accomplishes the task that I need, I just take the time to make one that will fit in my die saddles, and then I'm good to go, and I've got that set of dies from that point forward. So your collection of dies will grow rather quickly, and your die inserts, I guess I should call these, will grow rather quickly as you find applications for them in the blacksmith shop. So yeah, again, hope this was helpful. If you have any comments or questions, just drop them below and I'll do my best to answer. Thanks. Bye.